All right. So we're back. I'm going to pick up kind of right where we left off yesterday at verse 12. I'm going to be reading from verse 12 through verse 15 of James chapter 1. And it reads like this um, in the ESV. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to them that love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. And verse 15 concludes saying, Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. All right. I think when when I see verse 12 here as a really good hinge, as a really good transitional verse for us. In verse 12, we're told um, again something to anticipate, right? So it's still echoing back to the passage before verses 2 through 11. We're told to anticipate something beyond this life, right? In verses yesterday, what we were looking at was anticipating, right? We're looking at anticipating that God will answer prayer, anticipating wisdom that God will provide for us, right? Anticipating even eternity. But here we're being told what to anticipate in eternity, and specifically, we can anticipate reward, a true reward from the Lord. Crown of life is how James describes it. Um, and so we're told here that there's something to anticipate beyond this life, and I think that's a very important word for us. It's an important um, reality that we need to embrace because if nothing else, COVID-19 is forcing us to take stock of our own mortality. There's an opportunity here for us to really embrace what it means that we don't live on this earth you know in this time forever. We certainly don't. And so what happens for believers who have been faithful to Jesus and have loved him and yet um, had respiratory issues or had a really bad strain of the virus and are taken out. We have faith and the assurance that God is faithful, right? The same reason we anticipate the other things from the Lord in this life, all of the good He has promised. We anticipate something from the Lord in the life to come because of His faithfulness. So verse 12 also kind of harkens back to the other man, right? There's a blessing for the man who remains steadfast under trial. But interestingly enough, there's another man that we learned of earlier in the previous verses, and that man shouldn't expect anything from the Lord. Why? Because he's anything but steadfast, right? Clearly, that man is tossed and driven by the winds, so he can't be steadfast. External situations are what moves him, right? The external is what determines where he's going and how he's thinking. And so here we're being we're given a contrast to the one who is not um, um, to the one who is actually not driven by the winds. We have someone who's remaining steadfast. And interestingly enough, we've seen that word steadfast. This is at least the third usage of it. Verse 3 says that the testing of our faith produces steadfastness, right? And steadfastness is to have its full effect so that we would become complete and perfect, lacking in nothing. And now we're being told the blessing. The man who is happy is the one who stands firm under trial. All right. And so he has something to anticipate beyond this life. Verse 13 begins this discussion on a fight against sin. And what we see in verse 13 is the usage of a word tempt. And that's interesting because in previous or in older versions of scripture, other versions of English translations, we see um, the usage of the word tempt associated with what God does, right? God tempted Abraham in some other versions of scripture. But here we're being told that God tempts no one. Well, this is a good time for us to recognize that the words themselves are important, but nothing's more important than context, right? The way you use a word is often more determinative of what the word means than looking up the word in the dictionary. All right. And there's a lot to say about that, but I'm trying to keep these videos to a minimum. Um, when we think about testing and tempting, I think we can see very clearly that God's intent is different, right? And intent or motivation is really the difference between tempting and testing, right? In testing, we know God has a plan to use the test for the maturation, for the growth and development of our faith. That is very clear in the first couple verses in James. Testing is something for our good, for his glory. Tempting, of course, is towards sin, right? And we can see that very clearly. That verse 13 says, "Tempted with evil." Is the full picture of that. And so temptation is towards a sinful inclination that deteriorates our 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 faith, but actually testing is for the building up, the edification of our faith. So, verse 14 explains where all of this is coming from, and it's us, right? We can blame God, we can blame the devil, but James puts it squarely on us, says that we have our own desires. And let me say that desires are not always evil. Often desires are natural and they have a good use. They have a good purpose. But any desire that is not tamed and tempered by wisdom from God, which we find from His Word specifically through His Spirit, any desire that we have that is not tamed and tempered with loyalty to God, right? Look at verse 12 again. It says, the crown of life is promised to those who love Him, those who love God. Well, love and obedience go hand in hand. In terms of how God sees love, we know that for sure Jesus taught us that if we love Him, we will obey His commands. And so our natural desires should never overtake, no matter how, intensely we feel them or how good they seem to us. We have to submit those desires to the lordship of Jesus. All right. And so any desire that's not under control or being tamed by the wisdom of God and love for God is going to produce sin. And I like what he says here, that sin, when it's fully grown, right, will actually bring forth death. And that's the problem that we have, right? Right. I mean, I have two daughters myself, and sometimes my wife will ask, or we've had the conversation a couple times, I wonder what they'll look like, or can you imagine them grown up? And I really can't. And I think that inability to see something when it's full grown is a really good parallel to our inability to see how sin that we commit because it's pleasurable for a time, right? If it wasn't pleasurable, we wouldn't be doing it. So we have to be honest with ourselves about that. If we didn't see something beneficial in the sin, we wouldn't be engaged in it. But the truth is that, man, we don't see how the sin that we pet and the sin that we cultivate, the sin that we make time for, the sin that we make space for, the sin that we absolutely, guard and protect from somebody else exposing and or somebody else helping us, right? What we refuse to confess. We don't see how uh, those sins are actually growing into the death of us. We don't see it, and so James gives us a good warning, and I tell you, all of this conversation that we're having about COVID-19, I think it's a great opportunity for us to admit that no matter what else, we can't say we don't know how to fight sin. Okay, if we took COVID, if we took sin as seriously as we took this virus, well, if we took our sin as seriously as we take the virus, look at all the things we're willing to do, right? Stay clean, make sure you wash your hands, make sure you sanitize. I mean, there's all of this emphasis on things that we should have already been doing. Um, you know, there's all of this emphasis on avoiding and staying away, right? Social distancing, self quarantine, right? Right. It's not imposed by the government per se in terms of like a martial law, but it's we agree with the government, we agree with the CDC that it's a good thing to stay away from potentially spreading or potentially contracting the disease through social contact. Man, there's so many ways, and I wonder if we're seeing, how sin is like a virus, if we're seeing how sin really is um, something out to kill us. And I'm going to end it there because I think that's a good place to contrast, right? The crown of life versus the sin or the desire that becomes sin and ultimately death. I think James is putting it in front of us in black and white, man. Hey, it's going to be this way through loving the Lord, or it's going to be this way by loving our sin, right? The crown of life versus the sin that produces death. Our love for God um, gives us something good to anticipate. And sin, you can also anticipate. It's coming, whether we like it or not. Whatever we think of our sin, whatever we think of our desire, without God's wisdom, without true loyalty to Him,